Russia's current major media-related issue is the state's control of the country's media systems, and more specifically, bills similar to the draft law number 89417-6. The online journalism organization Reporters Without Borders reports that the bill was approved last July, allowing the Russian government to compile a list of websites that share offensive or harmful content. Issues with legislation similar to these are about an undisclosed amount of power that is given to the state when censoring content it considers offensive. Also, the Russian government has an extended history of media censorship and continues to eradicate opposing viewpoints throughout traditional news outlets.
The Russian version, Wikipedia, posted a public announcement condemning a draft law which is now under the review of the Russian Parliament. As stated, Law 89417-6, on the protection of children from information harmful to their health and development, the law would create a registry of any online materials containing illegal information relevant to children, specifically child pornography, drug paraphernalia, and instructions about self-harm. Any websites containing any related information have 24 hours to delete or shut down the site. Critics portray the legislation as an attempt to copy China's Great Firewall.
Yet, with this said, waves of bloggers and journalists have taken to social media to create an open forum with their followers to share their anti-government sentiments. According to Reporters Without Borders, many websites that post anti-government sentiments or websites that are critical of the Russian government all suffered attacks to their internal servers in the run-up to last year's presidential election. The journalists and bloggers affected by the attacks took to their Facebook and Twitter accounts to stage discussions of Russia's current political climate. Reporters Without Borders also stated that the state-run media outlet RIA Novosti was told to rid the site of any foreign articles that were critical of Vladimir Putin. We were able to interview an American businessman who travels to Moscow and other parts of Russia often for business.
Chief Executive Officer of Medical Excellence. There is some government influence is talked about from the government newspapers such as Izvestia and Pravda and TASS, T-A-S-S. All three of those, especially Pravda and TASS, are very government-oriented, and there is some skewing towards the government. You don't see much censorship on their side because most of it is already approved by the government.
The Russian people differ in opinion towards the media. Many who have no other access to information see the government and its media as infallible.
Speaking of, in terms of the lower income world, most of them take the Russian media as gospel in terms of accuracy. The more higher level people who have access to greater amounts of information and also greater variety of news sources view some of the Russian-based information sources with some skepticism, particularly since they have a pretty strong, very, very pro-government bias. And
as previously stated, most of Russia's media outlets are state-run. The two of the three main federal channels, according to the BBC's profile on Russia, are Channel 1 and Russian 1, both owned by the government. While the third main federal channel, NTV, is run by the state-controlled media energy giant, Gazprom. The most popular content published within the Russian media system is information with favorable sentiments towards the current Russian regime. Journalists that write controversial material are subject to violence. Just last May, in an article written by Reporters Without Borders, radio journalist Sergei Azlanian was stabbed repeatedly for reportedly making anti-Islamic statements and for reports about corruption amongst traffic police.
The Novaya Gazeta is one of the only media outlets in Russia that talks about the government in a negative light. They attempt to act as a fourth estate in Russia and report on the government from an unbiased perspective. The Gazeta is considered an opposition newspaper that was started in 1993 with almost nothing but 2 computers, 1 proofreader, and a few eager journalists. It is owned and operated by the autonomous nonprofit organization editorial and publishing house Novaya Gazeta. Their journalists are consistently targeted for speaking out against the government, and many columnists have died in the process. In Russia, being a journalist is an extremely dangerous job. The government owns the 6 main media outlets, so much of the content favors the government. Speaking out puts you in danger in Russia, and lives are continued to be lost in 2012 amidst Russia's post-Soviet society and their strides to democracy.
Anna Politkovskaya's desk is a shrine to her life and work. The 48-year-old journalist was one of the few critical voices in post-Soviet Russia. Her colleagues at Novaya Gazeta have kept it this way since her murder 5 years ago. They say they're still waiting for the truth.
We are not executioners or revenge takers. We just want a fair investigation and retribution for those who masterminded this awful crime.
When Politkovskaya was shot dead in 2006, Vladimir Putin, then president, said her journalism was insignificant and her murder was designed to spread anti-Russian sentiment. The likely return of Putin to the presidency next year has left the Politkovskaya family doubtful justice will ever be done.
I think that as we haven't had any political will so far, we won't have it in the future either. The same clan has stayed in power, the same political tandem and people. Nothing will change.
Politkovskaya was among dozens of Russian journalists killed in the last 20 years. A large number of cases remain unsolved. Many more journalists are harassed, beaten and jailed for uncovering crime and corruption, sometimes at the highest levels. But newspapers like Novaya Gazeta find it impossible to compete with the power and reach of the nation's 3 state-controlled television channels. Despite the spread of the internet, television is still the main source of news across this vast country. NTV was once privately owned and attracted the best journalists, but it was forcibly taken over in 2001 after running reports critical of Vladimir Putin. It's now owned by state energy company Gazprom and is devoting major airtime to Kremlin policy. The channel's editor-in-chief thinks the political opposition are irrelevant.
They are not interesting to anyone. They have no influence in society. They have nothing. Why should we use our airtime, which costs huge amounts of money, for marginal groups? Nobody's interested in them. Nobody wants to see that.
The reports and investigations in Novaya Gazeta rarely ever feature on state media. They're too much at odds with what the Kremlin wants Russians to hear. But there are stories journalists like Politkovskaya struggle to report. Stories fewer journalists in Russia are daring to tell. Niv Barker, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
A lot of freedom has come to Russian citizens in the form of social media. Information sharing has increased more than it ever has before. According to a finding by Internet World Stats, Russia has 59.7 million internet users. Even more so, Russia has over 20 million social media users. Yet, even with many Russian internet users, these numbers only represent Russians living in urban areas. Most Russian internet users living in rural areas have little access to broadband connection, and state-run television remains the main source of news.
See a couple of different differences. One, the difference between the city and the rural areas is access to cable and also access because economically most of those people earn very, very little money in Russia, and therefore their ability to have access to divergent information or international information or maybe even more free information is highly compromised because of their economic strata. That's the reality.
From Moscow all the way to New York City, what does this mean for digital rights on a global context?